Okay, we're here with Kurt Gonska, our next candidate for the Rent Control Board. Kurt, thanks for joining us. And do you want to just give us a little bit of a background of who you are and why you're running for Rent Control Board?
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks for taking the time, everybody. My name is Kurt Gonska. I am a Santa Monica resident since 2014. I grew up in Chicago, went to school, to college in Chicago, and lived there for a few years afterwards. And when I moved to California, I came straight to Santa Monica and have lived in rent controlled apartments ever since. Currently in a rent controlled apartment. And basically, over the both my last building and my current building, I had problems with my landlords that the rent control board and the city staff helped me navigate. And even with their help, even with doing a lot of research, it was a complex process to navigate. And having gone through that and having gotten to know a lot of activists in the city who have been working on rent control issues for many decades, I decided that I wanted to help my fellow residents and my neighbors navigate issues they're having as well. So I'm a strong supporter of rent control, and I'd be honored to have the Democratic Club's endorsement.
Cool, thanks so much. So, we know that after the conversation that happened last month with regard to rent control, we know the city council committed to this conversation, citywide conversation about rent control and re-examining the charter. So when that conversation comes up and you'll be at the center of that on the board, what will you be looking for in terms of specifically how to strengthen or tenant protections during that process?
Well, hopefully by the time we get to that point, we'll have already passed the ballot measure, reducing the max general adjustment down from 6% to 3%. So that's the first thing that we need to make sure happens this November. I'm sure we can get more into the details of that as this conversation goes on. But specifically, I'm open to hearing what people have to say about how to strengthen rent control. I'm not open to weakening it in any way, shape, or form. It is the reason that Santa Monica is the way it is. The reason we all love it is because of the character of the people who are here, and so many of those people wouldn't be able to afford to stay here without rent control or with weakened rent control. So that's my starting point. Is like if people have good ideas for how to strengthen it, I'm all ears. But as we saw with recent efforts that people in the city council have claimed were good intentioned, sometimes people bring forward ideas that they may think are good, but if you don't do the work to talk to the people who are experts in this field, to talk to the people who have been fighting this fight for decades, you don't know what those unintended consequences could be. So again, I'm open to conversations about how to strengthen it, how to give tenants more protections. But frankly, I think that the law as it exists now is really rock solid. And I think a big challenge is making sure that people understand what rights they have and how to exercise those rights. Because we could have the best law in the world, but if people don't know about their rights and if they don't know how to defend themselves and how to apply those rights, it's kind of not as meaningful.
Cool, thanks. Okay, who's got the next question? Patricia, go for it.
I'm always willing to jump in, you know that. So when asked about the appropriate scope of development approved in Santa Monica, and you were talking about the housing and not all development, which I will catch you up on. I mean, I'll ask you to catch up on in a minute, but the last sentence of your answer was that the additional units, talking especially about all those buildings on Lincoln Boulevard that haven't been filled, the additional units have not put downward pressure on rent prices in the city of Santa Monica. What would put downward pressure on rent prices?
Well, I think that part of there's been, I think, this idea among some people that all development, all additional units or all development in terms of housing is good development. And I think that there were a lot of people from the start that didn't buy that, but even those who thought that might be the case, we've seen that these, these sort of apartments that are $4,000, $5,000, $6,000 a month that are going up along Lincoln and other places, they're not really doing what we intend for them to do in terms of, people who can't afford to live here now are not going to be able to afford to move into one of those new units. So, we need to have, I think what would put downward pressure on pricing for apartments citywide is actually more affordable housing, deed restricted housing, because if there are more people in those affordable units than the existing units that are, at market rate now, which are relatively speaking more affordable than those on Lincoln, for example, there's more opportunity for vacancies in those types of units. So I think that's the start, is more affordable deed restricted housing. And then seeing what we can do to encourage development that is, in a price range that is deemed more affordable to the middle class.
Okay. And that's a really good answer in terms of housing now. But what about other kinds of development? What is the appropriate scope of non-housing development in Santa Monica? Have you thought about that? And I guess as a rent control board, running for rent control board, we don't need to hear as much about it as we do from council. But if you have any ideas, I'd love to hear them.
Yeah, I mean, I think that one interesting thing that I've heard people talk about and that I've thought about is, the scope of business usage of buildings is changing rapidly, and that was happening before COVID with retail seeing rapid change, but certainly with COVID, we've seen a lot of change in terms of occupied office space, and so I think understanding if we have more than enough that from what the market's demanding for office space, there may be opportunities to convert some of those properties to housing. I think that's one interesting idea to me that I would be interested in learning more about. But certainly, yeah, I mean, as the economy changes and as commercial development needs change, I think repurposing some of those existing structure or the land where potentially rezoning to create more opportunities for residential development.
Thank you.
Dan.
Thanks, John. I want to ask a question around diversity, equity, and inclusion. And one of the things that strikes me about this race is that we are replacing 2 women and a man with 2 men and a woman. And I'm just curious, how you're thinking about that and how you're going to ensure that what I presume you identify as a white cis male would kind of factor in other communities and other types of individuals in your decision making, and how you run meetings and how you're responding with the public.
Yeah, this is a really good question. Thank you for that. I think that the first thing I would say is that for the 3 of us who did qualify for the ballot, there is diversity amongst us in different ways than gender. And so that's point one. But I think also it is really important to understand, like, what is the type of diversity that we're lacking as a group of 5. Happily, the Anastasia Foster is currently on the board, will remain on the board, and she'll be, if Carolyn ends up winning the city council seat, then there'll be another vacancy that we'll need to fill. So the leader of the board, sort of with the longest tenure, will be a woman. And if we need to fill another vacancy, if Carolyn moves to the city council, I think that's an opportunity to make sure that we have a well-rounded group in terms of diversity. But I'm absolutely supportive of making sure that we don't have too much of one perspective. And I think different perspectives come from people of different backgrounds, and diversity is the name of the game there.
Great, let's go to Reno.
Sure. So, hi, Kurt, by the way.
Hello.
So my question was around how sometimes a person can feel discriminated against in a rent-controlled building. And discrimination can be, to some, negligible, especially when it's like little microaggressions that you can't really, maybe like legally quantify, for example. And so there are people I've known of who live in sort of a fear, if you will, in speaking up, in pointing things out, because they're afraid that, you know, it's going to affect their living circumstances. I'm wondering, do you have any thoughts about a policy measure or a process for that could be helpful to residents in those types of situations? And that could be, you know, affecting those of Black, brown, elderly, LGBTQ, you know, a variety of different areas where one can say, you know, I'm feeling like this because you're doing that and it's coming, you know, and then says, no, that's not what that means at all, you know, and it's like, where then does one go from there? Because it ends up then being a resident who feels like they're living in a very tenuous, hostile situation.
And that's a horrible situation for somebody to be in, because when we're talking about rent control, we're talking about people's homes. We're not talking about, you know, something that impacts you, you know, at one point in time. It's like something that day in and day out, when you come home, you may be in a very stressful situation at your job or with your children or whatever it is. You want to be able to come back to a place that is your home, that you feel comfortable and you feel safe in. And so that's something that for people in the situations like you just described, that is something that's constant if they're in that situation when they're at home, to feel that. So I can understand why that's so problematic and why people in those kind of situations need help. I think from a specific to your question about what public policy can we institute, I think it's really tough. I think, you know, there are obviously a lot of existing laws that could potentially be applied, but if people are nervous to come forward because they're worried about repercussions, I think a potential solution to that, and it's not an easy or a quick fix, but people need to feel like there's somebody who will listen to them, who they can trust will have their back. And I think a lot of people don't come forward because they think, what's the point? You know, like you said, there may be repercussions, they may be opening a can of worms they don't want to open. And if on top of that, the person they, or the body or the government entity they go to isn't really going to listen or really do much, then what's the point? And we need to combat that. And I think that in all opportunities, showing your openness, your open-mindedness, your willingness to fight for people is really important to get those people in those kind of unfortunate situations to feel comfortable to sit down and talk. And maybe they don't want to do it in a public setting like a rent control board monthly meeting, but maybe they'd want to give me a phone call or go grab a coffee with me, and they're more comfortable having those kind of one-on-one confidential conversations. And I will do my best day in and day out to make sure people know that they can approach me in that way, and we can have serious conversations about what solutions might be possible.
Thank you.
Thank you.
No.
Great. Hey, thank you.
Any other questions for anybody? Isabel.
I'll ask a question. Yeah, so Kurt, hi. I looked at your questionnaire and I see you're a very strong supporter of rent control, and that's why you're running. How do you feel that the rent control board has done so far, and do you see yourself more continuing their mission, or do you think there are things that they have missed or been weak on that you would like to emphasize more?
That's a really good question. I think overall, I think they've done a really good job in the current group over the past few years in terms of applying the existing law and policy appropriately and being strong advocates for tenants. I think generally speaking, they've done a very good job. I think one area that I will look to do an even better job at, because I know that they are, they're not sweeping this under the rug, but the communication element of it, to figure out what we can really do to over communicate with residents about what are their rights and what services and what types of issues can they come to commissioners or city staff about. Because as I said earlier, if people don't know what their rights are, they don't know how to apply them, they're not as meaningful. So I think one thing that the the board voted to do just the last month or two was to raise the registration fee, which, you know, frankly, that's one area where I probably would not have supported that this year, just because you asked the question about what, you know, how do I differ from the current group? I think that symbolically, it would have been better to, when we're talking about the need for people to have lower increases to be able to afford to stay in their homes, it would have been a symbolic gesture to not raise that fee. However, since they did vote to raise that fee, the budget will be slightly larger next year. And I think because of the way that the board typically does it, where they don't raise the fee every year, they try to price in enough of an increase to cover the next several years. I think in the first year, the second year of having that additional funding, there may be opportunities to do additional communication, mailers and other things to do what I just said, you know, to make sure tenants know what their rights are and how to apply them. So that's one thing that I'll be really focused on, is not that I think they've done a bad job of it, but how can we get out ahead of things with communication, such as, you know, next year, the rent increase in next September, hopefully we'll have a cap of 3%. But with the fact that we're already in that calculation period that started at the end of March to determine the next GA, means that it's probably going to be high again. It's probably going to be at that 3% cap. So we need to get out ahead of that. I think one thing that the board has gotten some criticism, some unfairly, but some criticism has been at sort of when this was brought to the city council, you know, the need to do something to reduce that 6% cap. And so I think the more that we can get out ahead of these issues and see them coming, and the more that we can communicate, the better off everyone will be.
Okay, thanks.
Okay, great. Any last questions? Otherwise, we can wrap it up. Okay, thanks, Kurt. Appreciate you coming by.
Yeah, thank you all.
Great. Good luck in the campaign.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Bye, guys.